One of the most disturbing things to me has been these calls for impeaching judges who people don't like their ruling. Do you think that this administration is going to ignore Supreme Court rulings?
If I was paying any attention, however, to the election returns, I would think that would be a very, very bad political course to take.
Let me ask you about some of the things that are going on in the country.
Sure.
First of all, what do you make of the hearing we're expecting, I think, at 3 o'clock, right after this show, where a judge is going to determine whether the administration intentionally violated his order, and if so, sort of what the remedy should be? What are you expecting there?
Well, I don't know if they're still relying on the state secrets privilege or not, and to avoid answering the question about when these planes both left the country and when word of his order was received. My impression of the state secrets privilege, and I only had one instance where I was exposed to it, it's pretty absolute, and which is why it's supposed to be seldom invoked. And it's been questioned in the past by federal judges, and that may come to pass in front of Judge Boasberg. I don't know. You and I are both aware of the sort of difficult situation federal district court judges are in giving orders to this administration. Yep. And, it may be an easy way out for the judge not to question the state secrets assertion, because if he doesn't, then the matter of contempt is sort of closed, and you can move on to what I think is probably the more important matter anyway, which is can the Alien Enemies Act really be invoked to summarily remove people from the United States without a hearing of any kind? And we kind of went round that barn in the case of Jose Padilla during who was accused of being a dirty bomber and was held incommunicado in a Navy brig in South Carolina for 4 years. And ultimately, the government, rather than defend that position in front of the Supreme Court, dismissed the case. All I would say to your listeners is, imagine it was your child who was grabbed by ICE and accused of being a member of Trinidad and Tobago or MS-13 and sent to this hellhole of a prison in El Salvador. Wouldn't you want the government at a minimum to have to prove that that he or she is been correctly identified, and to offer a reasonable basis on which to assert that he or she is a gang member? How can we live in a country where that at a minimum doesn't have to happen?
Well, and even Republican senators, I'm going to be pulling up numbers 29 and 30 here, which I'd like to play back to back. Even Senator James Langford, for example, is saying that he thinks she ought to have a hearing. Let's listen.
She should have due process. She's under a legal visa. That's entirely appropriate. We've not gone through the intelligence, at least I've not gone through the intelligence report specifically in that case. But I would tell you there is a requirement that if you're a student or under a legal visa here in the United States and you're supporting a terror organization, you can be removed from the United States. That is current federal law.
Do you agree with his analysis?
We're starting to get beyond my depth. I think no matter who you are or why you are on American soil, even if, like Jose Padilla, you're claimed to be an enemy combatant, you have some minimal due process rights.
Yeah.
So, and somebody who's legally here at the invitation of the government of the United States probably is beyond that. And I don't question the fact that if you're here and you're aiding a terrorist organization, that you should be expelled. I don't question the proposition at all. I'm just saying the government can't just wave its hands and say that's who you are and that's what you're doing without making some minimal showing in front of a federal judge.
Talking to legendary author and attorney Scott Turow about some of the things going on in the news before we talk about his new book. One of the most disturbing things to me has been these calls for impeaching judges who people don't like their rulings. Elon Musk and others have been calling for judges who even just issue temporary it's not even like the judges in these cases are ruling against them in most cases. All they're doing in most of these cases is saying, I just want to put it on hold for a moment as I evaluate. Oh, that judge should get impeached. I think that is such a scary thing for our judicial system. And again, this is why I think it is so important that Republican senators, and some of them have, been speaking out against that.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's Chief Justice Roberts spoke to this point pretty forcefully and just said, in this country, we don't impeach judges because we don't agree with their rulings. We appeal the rulings and count on the upper courts, the courts of review, to answer the question. I will say, Dan, that I've noticed since Justice Roberts spoke out that there's been a subtle shift, and now many people in the administration and their supporters in Congress are arguing that these judges, like Judge Boasberg, are exercising executive authority when they overrule or enjoin presidential actions. And that's horse hockey. When a judge is interpreting the law, a judge is performing the function that, under our understanding of the Constitution, that they're performing a function that was assigned to that judge. And they're not making a policy decision. They're just saying, well, this is what the law says, and this is what the cases that have interpreted that law say, and so here's what the government has to do. And this is yet another canard to support unlimited executive action, and that's frightening to me.
Do you think that this administration is going to ignore Supreme Court rulings?
I'll tell you, I don't make a faithful prediction on that. If I was paying any attention, however, to the election returns in Wisconsin, for example, I would think that would be a very, very bad political course to take. And I think that people in this country have perhaps a limited, but they do have some understanding of checks and balances. And they know that when judges rule, they're supposed to be obeyed. It goes without saying that Al Gore didn't like Bush versus Gore. He didn't agree with it, but he obeyed it. He stood down and allowed George W. Bush to become president of the United States. And if we're abandoning that tradition, we're in big trouble.
Finally, before we talk about Scott Turow's latest book, what do you make of all these law firms settling with the administration? I say settling, meaning there is no litigation. It's basically just caving when Donald Trump threatens that he's going to go after them. Now, I had a guest, Professor Jed Rubenfeld from Yale Law School, on the show earlier this week, who said, well, when you actually dig into the settlements, they're not doing that much more than they would have done otherwise. They're just still doing a lot of pro bono work and a lot of it is stuff that they would have done. how concerned are you about it, and what do you make of how these law firms have been responding?
Well, I mean, because I'm a lawyer, and because I'm a lawyer who was an assistant U.S. attorney, and then a criminal defense lawyer a long time, who depended on access to the federal buildings and the federal agencies, for my practice, I've been both appalled and deeply concerned. And I understand that when the president revokes your security clearance, that may have legitimate professional implications for some lawyers in these firms. But what really bothers me, Dan, is that, I haven't checked every firm that's settled with the White House, but the ones I have looked at, the average earnings per partner last year exceeded $5 million. That's the average, not the top guys, just the average per partner, $5 million. And if people who are making $5 million a year haven't saved enough that they feel that they can stand up for what's right, then we're in a very bad situation. And what really bothers me with firms of this stature and this wealth truckling to this president is what happens when the president, seeing he can get away with this, decides to start picking out solo practitioners who take on unpopular cases. There's no limit to this. Somebody who accepts a federal defender panel case and is vigilant in defending, for example, the people who were the object of the deportation orders that brought them to the El Salvador prison. They're not all big law firms that are in there representing these people. There's a lot of individual practitioners, immigration lawyers. Yeah, I can do it to Paul Weiss. I may as well do it to these individual lawyers, and I'll ban them from federal buildings and strip security clearances and prohibit them from dealing with federal agencies or having anything to do with federal contracts, which, by the way, would keep people from working as panel attorneys for the federal defender, because that's a federal contract. So the fact that the richest and the mightiest have not been willing to stand up in defense of principle is frankly appalling. And I certainly have written notes of appreciation to my friends in firms like Perkins Coie and Jenner and Block, who have chosen to stand and fight, because as far as I'm concerned, they are really defending the reputation of the American bar and saying that, money isn't everything. We're involved with doing justice. That's our first job. I am deeply, deeply concerned by the way the richest and the mightiest have run for cover. It leaves no protection for the less rich and the less mighty.